Hi, thank you for joining me. My name is Mindy Mandell, and this is all about Platonism. And today we're going to look at the dialogue Cratylus. So Cratylus looks at a lot of the etymology of different words. Socrates is going to look at the etymology of words like body and soul, and he'll look at many of the different gods and some of the terms that we use in metaphysics, like intellect or knowledge. But as fun as all of that is, the real meat of this dialogue is that he's looking at truth, that truth is beyond words, beyond names. And so there's a lot of discussions about what is the relationship between names and truth. Are names based on truth, or is it all just custom and habit? And if names are based on truth, does that mean that we can use names as a tool to recognize truth, or is there a problem with that? So they're going to go back and forth on many of these different issues. And I pulled out a number of different quotes that show us this theme developing throughout the dialogue. So we've got a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Okay, so it opens with two men named Hermogenes and Cratylus, and they're inviting Socrates to join their conversation. And by the way, all of our translations today are by Harold North Fowler, who I've used in a few other videos already. So Hermogenes starts off, "Here's Socrates. Shall we take him as a partner in our discussion? If you like." Cratylus, whom you see here, Socrates, says that everything has a right name of its own, which comes by nature, and that a name is not whatever people call a thing by agreement, just a piece of their own voice applied to a thing, but that there is a kind of inherent correctness in names. Okay, so that sets the groundwork for what we're doing. So Socrates responds as Hermogenes, son of Hipponicus. "There is an ancient saying that knowledge of high things is hard to gain, and surely knowledge of names is no small matter." And then Socrates takes a bit of a playful swipe at Prodigus, who is a sophist famous for mastery of language. He says, "Now if I had attended Prodigus's 50-drachma course of lectures, after which, as he himself says, a man has a complete education on the subject, there would be nothing to hinder your learning the truth about the correctness of names at once. But I've heard only the 1-drachma course, so I do not know what the truth is about such matters. However, I am ready to join you and Cratylus in looking for it." Okay, so with those words, the three of them are ready to dive into their discussion. So we saw already that Cratylus was taking the position that there is an inherent correctness in names. And we'll see that Hermogenes is taking on the role of the relativist. He says, "It seems to me that whatever name you give to a thing is its right name. And if you give up that name and change it for another, the later name is no less correct than the earlier. For I think no name belongs to any particular thing by nature, but only by the habit and custom of those who employ it, and who establish the usage." And in all fairness to Hermogenes, I think this is the conventional view, the view most people hold of names. That I'm recording this on a computer, and the word computer is one that we all just sort of agreed on. And same with words like car or book. Now, if we decided to change them around and say I drive my computer to work and I check the internet on my car, well, as long as we all agree, then that would become the new name. So that's the attitude most people have towards names. By giving us this relativist in the argument, it allows Plato then to take on the arguments against relativism. And if you're familiar with the dialogue Theaetetus, then you'll see a lot of the same arguments here that you saw there. So I'm not repeating them, but a lot of arguments against relativists. And then Socrates concludes that it's clear that things have some fixed reality of their own, not in relation to us nor caused by us. They do not vary, swaying one way and another in accordance with their own fancy, but exist of themselves in relation to their own reality imposed by nature. So our physical realm has a mode of reality of its own. Things exist without us causing them. And then from there he goes on to say, in naming also, if we are to be consistent with our previous conclusions, We cannot follow our own will, but the way and the instrument which the nature of things prescribes must be employed, must they not? And if we pursue this course, we shall be successful in our naming, but otherwise we shall fail. So he's saying that because things have a mode of reality of their own, then the name must follow some rule. And then he goes on to make the case that names are instruments. And some examples: what has to be woven with something, and what has to be bored with something. And here, of course, to be bored does not mean to feel boredom, it means to drill a hole. And he goes on to say, what is that with which we have to bore? A bore. And that with which we weave? A shuttle. And that with which we name? A name. And so he concludes that a name also then is a kind of instrument. And now that he's told us that it's an instrument, he wants to look now at who uses this instrument and how it's used. So the name being an instrument, what do we do with it when we name? Hermogenes cannot tell. Do we not teach one another something and separate things according to their natures? Certainly. A name is then an instrument of teaching and of separating reality, as a shuttle is an instrument of separating the web? Yes. But the shuttle is an instrument of weaving? Of course. The weaver then will use the shuttle well, and well means like a weaver. And a teacher will use a name well, and well means like a teacher. Okay, so there he set up a teacher as the one who uses a name, and the way it's used is to teach, to separate things according to their nature. Sounds a lot like dialectic, right? Now he's going to go on to look at who gives the names. Whose work will the teacher use when he uses the name? I cannot tell that either, Hermogenes says. And can you not tell this either? Who gives the names we use? No. Do you not think it is the law that gives them to us? Very likely. Then the teacher, when he uses a name, will be using the work of a lawgiver? I think so. Then it is not for every man, Hermogenes, to give names, but for him who may be called the name maker. And he, it appears, is the lawgiver, who is of all the artisans among men the rarest. Now this term lawgiver may seem a little bit strange, but it follows from Socrates' argument that things have a mode of reality of their own, and therefore there must be some law or rule by which names would be given. Okay, now he's going to take it a step further. Now see what the lawgiver has in view in giving names. Look at it in the light of what has gone before. What has the carpenter in view when he makes a shuttle? Is it not something the nature of which is to weave? Certainly. Well then, if the shuttle breaks while he's making it, will he make another with his mind fixed on that which is broken, or on that form with reference to which he was making the one which he broke? On that form, in my opinion. Then we should very properly call that the absolute or real shuttle. And he goes on to say the artisan must discover the instrument naturally fitted for each purpose. It must embody that in the material of which he makes the instrument, not in accordance with his own will, but in accordance with its nature. So now we're looking at levels of cause, that this lawgiver or name maker is a cause, but so is the level of eidos, or the real or absolute things in themselves. For each kind of shuttle is, it appears, fitted by nature for its particular kind of weaving, and the like is true of other instruments. Yes. Then, my dear friend, must not the lawgiver also know how to embody in the sounds and syllables that name which is fitted by nature for each object? Must he not make and give all his names with his eye fixed upon the absolute or ideal name, if he is to be an authoritative giver of names? Okay, so there again, the level of cause of the absolute or ideal, of the absolute reality. Now, I think a lot of people have objections here. If you're looking at it from the perspective of metaphysics and you're familiar with Platonic metaphysics, you can see where Socrates is coming from. But certainly from the conventional view, this is not our experience with names because, of course, there are different languages, and so there are different sounds and syllables depending on the language. And then, of course, words evolve through generations. And so you can think of many objections to this argument and support the relativist argument. Now, Socrates and Plato obviously would have known those arguments, and so Socrates adds this. If different lawgivers do not embody it in the same syllables, we must not forget this ideal name on that account. For different smiths do not embody the form in the same iron, though making the same instrument for the same purpose. But so long as they reproduce the same ideal, though it be in different iron, still the instrument is as it should be, whether it be made here or in foreign lands. Is it not? So what he's showing here is that there is a distinction between the realm of reality itself and our physical realm, which has a mode of reality and a similitude to reality itself, but is separate or different. It has progressed away from reality. And so there's a similitude, but also when you go from same to similar, it means you're also introducing difference. Now this allows us then to avoid the dichotomy of either saying that we're only relativists, where anything goes and everything is equal to everything else, and who's to say what's right or what's wrong. That's the relativist argument, focusing only on the physical realm. We also need to avoid going to the opposite extreme and rigidly insisting that there's one way to do everything because there's an absolute truth. Instead, what Socrates is introducing is a sort of fluidity and openness to allow for the relativity of our physical realm while also recognizing truth itself. And so what this means is that in order to recognize truth in this physical realm, you need more than just a skill or some learning in school. What you need is wisdom. Okay, he goes on with another argument here. Who would know best about the work of the shipbuilder, the navigator, and who can best superintend the work of the lawgiver and judge of it when it's finished, both here and in foreign countries? The user, is it not? Yes. And is not this he who knows how to ask questions? Certainly. And the same one knows also how to make replies? Yes. And the man who knows how to ask and answer questions you call a dialectician? Yes, that is what I call him. And the work of the lawgiver, as it seems, is to make a name with the dialectician as his supervisor, if names are to be well given. So our levels of cause now have added another level. Then, Hermogenes, the giving of names can hardly be, as you imagine, a trifling matter, or a task for trifling or causal persons. And Cratylus is right in saying that names belong to things by nature, and that not everyone is an artisan of names, but only he who keeps in view the name which belongs by nature to each particular thing, and is able to embody its form in the letters and syllables. Okay, so we have another layer here. You've got the lawgiver or name giver, you've got the dialectician that person turns to, the things in themselves, which they're both looking towards. Now from here, Socrates is going to introduce Homer and talk a little bit about him. Now this part can be a little confusing, so I'm going to read it first and then say some words about it. Why, Socrates, what does Homer say about names and where? In many passages, but chiefly and most admirably in those in which he distinguishes between the names by which gods and men call the same things. Okay, now this is confusing, that gods and men have different names, and Homer is writing about them, but of course Homer was writing in Greek, and even the names that he claimed the gods knew were Greek words that he wrote in his poems. So it doesn't really make sense. The way to understand this is to keep in mind Platonic metaphysics. And so here's a little flowchart that some of you have seen before. I've used this in another video. So here we see that absolute reality is the realm of the eidos in Greek, or what academia calls forms or ideas, what I call absolute realities. And then reality unfolds through similitude into spiritual realm, and we have here the material realm. And we see that each of these realms has a mode of reality that is right for its own station. And each is good and right in its own way. But as realms progress, they progress in differentiation, so less unified, and also they have a different level of power. And so by saying that the gods have different names, this is a poetical expression of absolute reality, having a different mode of reality from our physical realm. And oh yeah, let me go back for a moment here. I just want to point out here that Homer was a poet, and he was giving a poetical representation of this metaphysics. Now, certainly there were fundamentalists in Plato's day, but Plato was not one of them. Neither was Socrates, and I don't think Homer was either. Homer did not, I don't think, intend for his work to be taken in such a literal way as some people did take it. There were, of course, fundamentalists in Plato's day, and he liked to make fun of them. And in fact, if you know the early dialogue, Euryphro, then you see a dialogue where he most directly is making fun of fundamentalists. And I do think that's significant here because Euryphro is mentioned a number of times in this dialogue, and I have a quote where one of those mentions is, I counted 5, I think there are 5 mentions. Here's one of them where Socrates had just given the etymology of some of the father gods, and Hermogenes was quite impressed with that, and Socrates says, yes, I'm convinced the inspiration came to me from Euryphro, the Prosbaltian, and he loved to talk about father gods. I was with him and listening to him a long time early this morning. Now, my understanding is that among scholars there is some debate as to whether or not this Euryphro mentioned here is the same Euryphro as the one in the dialogue by that name. And part of the disagreement is because this Euryphro, as you can see, is from Prosbalta, and the other Euryphro was bringing charges against his father in the Athenian court. Now, I will readily concede that this is not my area. I'm most concerned with the substance of these dialogues, and so I will readily confer to the experts or to the scholars on these sorts of matters. As I understand, it is possible to have dual citizenship, and so that in itself is not a problem. Now, here's a quote from a book by Deborah Niles, who is a Platonic scholar, and her expertise is in prosopography, which is looking at the historical background of characters, in this case in Plato. And she makes the case that it is the same Euryphro. She says, since Socrates is represented in the dialogues as conversing with some of the same people repeatedly over his lifetime, 2 or many more discussions with Euryphro would not be surprising. What would be surprising is a second Euryphro with the same mantic bend as the first, because they're both fundamentalists, and the same claim to expertise in father gods, Uranus, Cronus, and Zeus. And then she gives these 2 citations. Those are part of the quote. I did not add them. So in the quote that I had showed you just a moment ago, Socrates had just been talking about Uranus and Cronus. And so that's the citation she gives here, Cratylus 396b. Her citation of Euryphro is a reference to his talking about Cronus and Zeus, because in that dialogue, Euryphro is bringing charges against his own father for wrongdoing, and he defends it by saying that Cronus did wrong, and his son Zeus called him out on that and punished him for that. And so here we have a Euryphro, in both dialogues, we have a Euryphro who is a fundamentalist and who has an expertise in father gods. Now, according to Deborah Niles, these 2 dialogues are spaced some 20 years apart. It's not the same day. So the dialogue Euryphro takes place on the courthouse steps right after Socrates learns of the charges brought against him, so it comes at the end of his life. And she dates the Cratylus some 20 years earlier. So Euryphro would have been in his 20s in this dialogue and in his 40s in the dialogue Euryphro. Okay, so he's going to come up again later. I'm going to mention him again later in this video, and so that's why I took a few minutes to discuss this here. But now I want to go back to the idea that the names that the gods use are more precise and correct than the names that humans use. And this again matches to the metaphysics. We're more likely to find the correct names in the nature of the eternal and the absolute. So again, here's our flowchart, and I've added gods to it because if we're going to add the gods to our series of causes, then we have to see where they fit in. And the gods then would have to be beyond our flowchart, really, because if they are the ones who give the names to the Eidos, who give those names, then they must be prior to them. And so what we're seeing here is that the gods, because the realm of absolute reality is the realm of knowledge, it means the gods are beyond knowledge. And Socrates states that here, of the gods we know nothing, neither of them or of their names, whatever they may be, by which they call themselves. For it is clear that they use the true names. And so he makes this suggestion. If you like, let us first make a kind of announcement to the gods, saying that we are not going to investigate about them, for we do not claim to be able to do that, but about men, and let us inquire what thoughts men had in giving them their names, for in that there is no impiety. And then we're going to just also tie up again, clarify the point that in our physical realm, there is some relativity that works in because the similitude has progressed far enough that we do see some relativity in the names we give. He says, you do not bear in mind that the original words have before now been completely buried by those who wish to dress them up, for they've added and subtracted letters for the sake of euphony. So again, reminding us that there is relativity in this realm, but if we have our eyes focused upward, looking at truth, then we are not going to be bothered by this. And he points out also that looking up is the way to acquire a pure mind. He says, Kronos, according to tradition, is the son of Urania, but the upward gaze is rightly called by the name Urania, looking at the things above, and the astronomers say, Hermogenes, that from this looking, people acquire a pure mind. Okay, so just as in our metaphysics, we want to trace things back to a first principle, so too, Socrates is saying that in looking at names, we want to trace things back to what he calls an element. If we ever get hold of a word which is no longer composed of other words, we should be right in saying that we had at last reached an element. And this is significant because our metaphysics is a top-down approach. And he's saying that there's a parallel in the way he thinks of names. And yet if anyone is, no matter why, ignorant of the correctness of the earliest names, he cannot know about that of the latter, since they can be explained only by means of the earliest, about which he is ignorant. So our study of metaphysics is not to look at the physical realm and try to understand ourselves in this realm, because we can't really distinguish what is a similitude of truth versus where did ignorance or error work its way in. Instead, we take a top-down approach, and he's taking the same approach to names, so he's showing a parallel there. Okay, and that up to now, Socrates had been talking to Hermogenes. Cratylus now comes back into the discussion. So Socrates challenged the relativist position, and now we're going to see that he has a challenge to Cratylus as well. Okay, what is the function of names, and what good do they accomplish? I think, Socrates, their function is to instruct, and this is the simple truth, that he who knows the name knows also the thing named. So Cratylus believes that if you know the name, then you can use that to know truth. Now let us see what this manner of instruction is to which you refer, and whether there is another method, but inferior to this, or there is no other at all. What do you think? I think there is no other at all. This is both the best and the only method. So Cratylus believes that you can use names to know truth, and this is the only method. Now Socrates has a problem with this. And it's the problem that many of us probably have with the biblical religions. If you're interested in Platonism as a spiritual system, then you probably have a problem with the idea that if something is written in the Bible, it must be true. And people who adhere to that idea would insist that the Bible is infallible and that the people who wrote it were looking at truth, and therefore it must be, everything they wrote must be true. There's no way that infallibility worked into their interpretations. And that's really the argument that Cratylus is making as well. But Socrates has a problem with it on two levels. First, when you bring in the idea of similitude in this progression of reality, you're automatically bringing in the idea of other or difference. And he says, do you not perceive how far images are from possessing the same qualities as the originals which they imitate? Now, when we're talking about metaphysics, we use imitate in a kind of a metaphorical way. It's not that the lower realms are imitations, it's that they're similitudes. And so again, when something is similar but not the same, it means you're introducing difference as well. A name is an imitation, just as a picture is. And now this allows him to make this comparison. If then we compare the earliest words to sketches, it is possible in them, as in pictures, to reproduce all the appropriate colors and shapes, or not all. For some may be wanting, and some may be added, and they may be too many or too large. Is not that true? Yes, it is. Then he who reproduces all produces good sketches and pictures, and he who adds or takes away produces also sketches and pictures, but bad ones. Yes? One more step. And how about him who imitates the nature of things by means of letters and syllables? By the same principle, if he gives all that is appropriate, the image, that is to say, the name, will be good. And if he sometimes omits or adds a little, it will be an image, but not a good one. And therefore some names are well and others badly made. Is that not true? Perhaps. Perhaps then one artisan of names will be good and another bad? Yes. And so here we have a second objection, that not only is there this progression of reality that naturally is going to introduce difference, but when you bring in the human element, you bring in the possibility of a bad interpretation. And so on two levels, we cannot use names to find truth. And he goes on, the name of such an artisan was Lawgiver? Yes. Perhaps then by Zeus, as is the case in the other arts, one lawgiver may be good and another bad, if we accept our previous conclusions. And now Socrates is going to give some examples. Some of the words that he gave etymologies for point to a reality that is always in flow. And he points out here Heraclitus, who had said we never step in the same river twice. Here are some examples. Joy seems to have its name from the plenteous diffusion of the flow of the soul. Or a similar word, mirth, the motion of the soul in harmony with the universe. Love. Love is so called because it flows in from without, and this flowing is not inherent in him who has it, but is introduced through the eyes. Truth, the divine motion of the universe. And here's one more, virtue. It would signify first ease of motion, and secondly, that the flow of the good soul is always unimpeded. Now Socrates is going to point out that while these words point to a reality that's always in flow, there are other words that point to a reality that is at rest. A few examples. Knowledge. It indicates that it makes our soul stand still. Or idcor, it means stops the flow. One more. Memory expresses rest in the soul, not motion. And then he wraps it up with this general statement, I think we could, if we took pains, find many other words which would lead us to reverse our judgment, and believe that the giver of names meant that things were not in progress or in motion, but were at rest. And because we have two alternate views of reality, it means we need some other standard. It is plain we must look for something else, not names, which shall show us which of these two kinds are the true names. Which of them, that is to say, show the truth of things. And so he makes this case with Cratylus. then if it be really true that things can be learned either through names or through themselves, which would be the better and surer way of learning? To learn from the image, whether it is itself a good image, and also to learn the truth which it imitates, or to learn from the truth, both the truth itself and whether the image is properly made. And while Cratylus wants to study the name, he says, when you put it that way, Socrates, it certainly is better to learn from the truth. So how realities are to be learned or discovered is perhaps too great a question for you or me to determine. But it is worthwhile to have reached even this conclusion, that they are to be learned and sought for, not from names, but much better through themselves than through names. And then he wants to just wrap things up. He looked at some things that point to a reality that's always in flow and some things that point to reality at rest. And so he wants to address that issue. Which one is correct? He says, let us examine one further point to avoid being deceived by the fact that most of these names tend in the same direction. Suppose it should prove that although those who gave the names gave them in the belief that all things are in motion and flux, and Socrates says, I myself think they did have that belief. Still, he maintains, in reality that is not the case, and the name givers themselves, having fallen into a kind of vortex, are whirled about, dragging us along with them. Consider, my worthy Cratylus, a question about which I often dream. Shall we assert that there is any absolute beauty or good, or any other absolute existence, or not? I think there is, Socrates. Then let us consider the absolute, not whether a particular face or something of that sort is beautiful, or whether all these things are in flux. Is not, in our opinion, absolute beauty always such as it is? And then he goes on to make an argument that some of you may recognize from the Theaetetus. He says, if the very essence of knowledge changes at the moment of the change to another essence or knowledge, there would be no knowledge. And if it is always changing, there will always be no knowledge. And by this reasoning, there will be neither anyone to know, nor anything to be known. And so, by bringing in this whole debate over whether reality is in flow or at rest, and whether names were properly given, he's showing the danger of using names to point to truth, because fallibility can enter into our interpretations of truth. And so Socrates' conclusion: surely no man of sense can put himself and his soul under the control of names, and trust in names and their makers to the point of affirming that he knows anything. So again, this is the challenge to us, to always remember that we must be diligent and not assume that if we're looking at truth, that there's no interpretation working into our calculations or our contemplations. And also, again, this is same sort of critique against systems that look to their wisdom writings, such as the biblical traditions, and even other traditions as well. I don't mean to pick on the Bible specifically, but any tradition that says that their books are infallible. Socrates would have issue with that. And so Socrates' advice to Cratylus: you must consider courageously and thoroughly, and not accept anything carelessly. I almost made it all the way to the end without a drink. All right, Cratylus says, I will do so. However, I assure you, Socrates, that I've already considered the matter, and after toilsome consideration, I think the doctrine of Heraclitus, that we never step in the same river twice, is much more likely to be true. And so Cratylus is still sticking with his belief that you can study names to know truth. And that's where the dialogue ends. If you have any questions or comments, I do encourage you to drop me an email or put a comment below. And as always, I do encourage you also to read the full dialogue yourself. And if you have any questions from reading, even if it's not something covered in the video, feel free to write to me. Also, always I ask you please think about subscribing and liking and sharing. Next week, I'm going to look at one of the more popular, more beautiful dialogues in the series, the Phaedo. A very beautiful dialogue, so I do hope you'll join me next week. Thank you so much.